explain what kratom is. I have Mr. Haddow here, who is the expert for all things kratom. So if you have any questions, I seriously recommend you direct them to Mr. Haddow. Kratom is a naturally grown product, grown primarily in Indonesia. It is currently used by about 15 million Americans. It is also being bought out of state by Rhode Islanders and brought back to Rhode Island and consumed by them. It is used by people to overcome opioid addiction, opioid withdrawal, to treat depression, anxiety, diarrhea, and coughing. Kind of a weird grouping, but this legislation very specifically establishes product limitations. The product shall not be altered or mixed with non-kratom substances. The product shall not be contaminated with non-kratom materials. The product shall not have any synthetics added to it. It establishes that retailers may not sell the product to anyone under the age of 21. And it establishes fines for those who operate contrary to the Kratom Act. And it also establishes that the product will be taxed. Most of you on this committee voted to legalize cannabis. Some who've been here as long as myself even voted to decriminalize it. Most of you also voted to legalize the use of mushrooms. Dr. McDonald, who was the head of the Rhode Island Department of Health for many years, was the biggest obstruction from the Department of Health against this particular piece of legislation. Dr. McDonald is now the head of the New York State Department of Health, where kratom is legal. It is legal to use, it is legal to sell, it is legal to consume. And I have seen no change in the status of kratom since Dr. McDonald's arrival on the scene in New York. 45 of our sister states allow people to use kratom freely and openly. 11 states also have legislation very, very similar to this legislation. The status of in Rhode Island needs to be changed so we can join our sister states in allowing the free use of kratom. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee.
Thank you, Floor Manager. We'll go to Mac.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I welcome this opportunity to discuss kratom with you. I'm the Senior Fellow on Public Policy with the American Kratom Association and engaged in this issue back in 2016, which is the source of the controversy around kratom when the U.S. Food and Drug Administration recommended that kratom be added as a Schedule I substance under the Controlled Substances Act as a illegal substance in the United States. The criteria for that is governed by the Controlled Substances Act, and it requires that there be specific criteria met. In this particular instance, in 2016, the FDA used an abbreviated process, calling it an emergency request for scheduling. But it still required that the FDA demonstrate that, in fact, kratom was dangerous. And under Factor 6 of the 8 criteria that are required, 3 of which are required for emergency scheduling, they had to declare, and they did so in a Federal Register notice, that kratom is in fact dangerous for consumption by Americans. The Drug Enforcement Administration reviewed that request and rejected it, said that they wanted a full 8-factor analysis to be provided. For context, there were 147,000 Americans who petitioned under the We the People website at the White House saying kratom should not be banned. The Drug Enforcement Administration received 6,000 calls. Never in their history had they seen that many calls on a substance recommendation like that from individual citizens who were consuming kratom. The FDA rejection, when the DA did it, in 82 previous scheduling requests using the emergency power section, all had been approved. This was unprecedented for the DEA to say no to the FDA. When the FDA produced its second full 8-factor analysis in 2017, it was reviewed by the Department of Health and Human Services. Dr. Brett Shaw, who was the Assistant Secretary for Health, rejected it, withdrew the recommendation that had been submitted to the DEA. He called it disappointingly and embarrassingly poor evidence and data. A scathing rebuttal, and that letter is available to you in the committee record that's been submitted. You should read it, because it also declares that by banning kratom, that you put millions of Americans at risk for having to forcing them onto other kinds of drugs that are far more dangerous and more addictive than kratom ever could be demonstrated to be. It is important to put that into context, because the FDA maintained through 2018 that kratom was in fact dangerous. They took a third strike at the apple. They went to the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs in 2021, and because the United States is a treaty partner, and the standard for international scheduling is less than the United States Controlled Substances Act, they thought they could get a win at the international level, and that would have compelled the US to commence scheduling procedures for kratom. In a unanimous vote, the Expert Committee on Drug Dependence, 12 international independent scientists from around the globe evaluated the FDA's recommendation and said that it was not sufficient. The reason it's not sufficient has now come to light. And this is new evidence that none of the letters that you have received in the committee record addresses. And it's important for this committee to consider. And I think, Representative McGaugh, it addresses specifically your objections that we discussed last year. In December of 2023, the FDA was required by a federal judge in the Southern District of California, in a case that the FDA itself initiated against an importer of kratom who had violated the import alert. The judge ordered the FDA to come to a Brady hearing, which was supposed to have taken place on February 8th of 2024 in his court, asking the FDA to demonstrate why they believed that kratom was dangerous. The FDA, in an official communication to the court, refused to attend, and the basis for doing that, and this is from an email that's in your committee records, that the FDA, had not yet made a determination whether kratom is dangerous. That was a stunning admission by the FDA, given their decade-long attack on kratom, claiming that it was in fact dangerous, twice having published in the federal record that in fact it was dangerous. And suddenly the FDA says now they could not stand before a federal judge under oath and say that kratom was dangerous. Why? We now know, because in February, last month, we had the Deputy Commissioner of the FDA in a webinar with the Alliance for a Stronger FDA, admitting that what the FDA wanted to do with kratom now was to find a way to regulate manufacturers, make sure that kratom was manufactured correctly. They wanted to make sure that it was marketed correctly without illegal therapeutic claims, and they wanted to make sure it wouldn't be available to consumers. That sounds like the Kratom Consumer Protection Act that's before you today. But the reason why all of this took place was revealed on February 15th of last month at a scientific congress, a conference, the third annual International Kratom Symposia, where hundreds of scientists were present, and the FDA made their presentation. They said that they had conducted a dose-finding study on kratom. That is a safety study. They had 40 human participants in that study. It's a single ascending dose study, which means they give you a dose of kratom to start, and then they keep increasing it until they find an adverse event. Now, the FDA, if you listened and read all of their evidence at that point, people at 4 grams of kratom would have been throwing themselves on the floor and having seizures, because that's the evidence they had presented to the DEA. They got to 12 grams of kratom, which is an enormous dose, and here's the important part, done in 5 minutes, 24 capsules of kratom administered, and they found 2 of the 40 participants experienced nausea. That's a stunning safety study on kratom. The FDA characterized their study to this scientific symposium that kratom is well tolerated at all dose levels. The idea that you would be consuming 12 grams of kratom in a 5-minute period and only experience nausea is a safety study of enormous proportion. Now it allows for the FDA to proceed what's called a human abuse potential study, which will review the severity of dependence or in fact addiction to kratom. That will take 2 to 4 years. That's something that the FDA previously had said would not be possible because it was precluded by the evidence and data that they claimed to have that kratom was in fact dangerous. And now the FDA cannot maintain that position. So what's most important here is, what is important is that consumers have access to kratom. As a part of the discussion and the policy briefs that I just referenced are in your committee materials, You hear about deaths that are attributed to kratom. Why do medical examiners and coroners around America say that kratom causes deaths of people? There is no known toxic level of kratom, and the scientists acknowledge that. None. But you have medical examiners who routinely say it's metrogeny intoxication, metrogeny being the principal component. I'm going to read to you from an amended report from a coroner that's dated on, let me get the exact date, 3/6/2024, just a couple of days
Mac,
ago.
if you could do the abbreviated version of,
Okay, just to make
because we all do have it in our packet.
they changed the autopsy, and they said that because of review of the current literature, this coroner now determined that it was inappropriate to call that a metrogeny death. We think that many more are coming. This bill is important for the citizens of Rhode Island, so they can have access to pure, unadulterated kratom, so that it's well regulated and that we can move forward with allowing access. As Representative Bergman, who's Lieutenant General in the Marine Corps formerly, says that veterans depend on this in order to help them, and we all should stand for that, to give access to veterans and to other people that use kratom. Thank you.
And Mac, it's 45 states that it's legal in right now?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions? Representative McGaugh.
You know, I always have questions on this bill. So I commend you on your grassroots organizing. I can understand when you say so many people contacted the federal government in regards to this, because I know that we have seen that here as well. So I commend you on your grassroots organizing. You said that the FDA had not determined that this was dangerous. Has the FDA come out with a statement saying that this is safe?
So the federal judge ordered the FDA to his courtroom to give evidence on a case they initiated saying that kratom was dangerous. And they responded saying, we have not yet determined whether kratom is dangerous.
Okay.
Now, they've not said.
But there's currently not a statement saying that it is safe either, is that correct?
No, that's not correct. If you believe what the FDA dose finding study reported from an FDA scientist who reported to the International Symposium on Kratom, where he said that kratom was safely administered and tolerated across all dose levels to 40 humans, and they got to 12 grams, which is an enormous dose of kratom in a 5-month period, or 5-minute period. So that's a fairly significant safety study.
So it's currently being studied.
Well, like most things, yes. There's also a human study, clinical trial, that was submitted to the FDA with almost 300 human participants, well tolerated, no safety problems.
I'm sorry to cut you off. I think you answered my question on that. My other question is, this is a drug that works primarily on opioid receptors. Are there any other products available in the United States that work directly on opioid receptors that would be available, say, in convenience stores and gas stations with the limited oversight that this bill proposes?
So respectfully, it's not a drug. It's a plant. It's not classified as a drug. And that's the science demonstrates that. It's plant material. It's not a drug.
There's
It's
a lot of drugs that are plant materials, but okay.
Well, this one, ma'am, this is not a drug. It is a botanical supplement classified by the FDA as such. It's not classified by the FDA as a drug, so calling it a drug is inappropriate. But to the point that you're making is, are there other substances that you can buy at convenience stores that alleviate pain? Sure, there's Advil, Tylenol, Aleve, all kinds of pain relief medications that are.
Do those products work on the opioid receptors?
Sure, well, I'll tell you what else.
Primarily?
Cheese hits the opioid receptor, but remember that the actually touching the opioid receptor, the science demonstrates that kratom is not a full agonist, and you probably know better than I do about that, but a partial agonist, which means it does not go to the sector of the brain where you have euphoria. It does not go to the sector of the brain where you have respiratory suppression, which are the classic signature effects of opioids. Kratom does not do that. It does go to the sector of the brain which allows for pain relief, and it goes to the section of the brain that actually helps unbind the effects of opioids, and that's been demonstrated by science that was funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse.
Another question that I have regarding this is the oversight of, there's a lot of safety measures that have been put into this to protect the community from kratom. How do you foresee, and Rep. Edwards, maybe this is a question that you can answer, how do you foresee this oversight happening? Who would there be somebody doing testing on the product? Would there be somebody reviewing the labeling of the product? How do you foresee that being enforced?
Actually, I would defer that to Mr. Hanna because they've done it in other states. I'm sure they'll follow suit.
So this is a great question because it's important to us as a consumer organization. Everything in the dietary supplement space is self-regulated at the federal level. The FDA does not really have a force of people to go out and investigate. It's all based on complaints. So we expect that when you have a violation of the specific provisions of the Rhode Island Kratom Consumer Protection Act, you'll probably see complaints that come in, and then based on the credibility of those complaints, there could be an investigation. If there is a product that is suspect, then the law requires that the processor, the manufacturer of that product, would submit an updated certificate of analysis conducted at their expense in order to continue maintaining sale of kratom in Rhode Island. We think that's an important provision.
So if there was a complaint, the manufacturer would do an analysis? The processor would do an analysis of the product?
The law requires that the kratom product that's introduced for sale in the state of Rhode Island must meet specific standards, and a certificate of analysis from an independent laboratory is required in order to certify that that's the case. So if there's a complaint, you absolutely would require the manufacturer at their expense to provide an updated certificate of analysis, or they lose the ability to sell kratom in the state of Rhode Island. Equally true, if you have a retailer who is violating the 21 and over or under provision, that's what you do for cigarettes and alcohol today, whatever the age limit is, and you have the same kind of enforcement mechanism. There are fines associated with the actual violation of those things. We're open, Representative McGaugh, to any suggestion you might make or others that could amend this bill to take care of that. We don't want this to be a burden on the citizens of Rhode Island to fund anything. We want this to be the burden upon the manufacturers who are producing these products.
So yeah, so it sounds to me like the processor or the manufacturer. But getting back to your point about the processor or the retailer being able to the age limitation. And Rep. Edwards, I know you stated when you introduced it that retailers would not be able to sell it to anyone under the age of 21. And looking at the language, it actually says the processor. And in I thought at first, well, it does say under processor, it says anybody that sells it. But then there's a separate definition for retailer. And when you talk about the age limitation, that specifically talks about processors, not the retailer. So it looks like the manufacturer, the processor, isn't able to sell to someone under the age of 21, but maybe the retailer, that restriction does not necessarily apply to the retailer according to the...
If that's the issue,
case, that's
it's
something
something clean up.
we could always amend.
Very,
if
very
that-
simple.
If that's
Very
an issue,
simple.
Yeah, I wanted
we
to...
can amend the language on
Yeah,
that.
I definitely wanted to point that out.
While you're at, so Vice Chair Caldwell, would you like your votes recorded on the affirmative?
Yes, please.
So ordered.
I'm going to stop my questioning here. I have a lot of questions, but I was kind of hoping, I saw that, say that the Department of Health is opposed, the Rhode Island Medical Society is opposed, Buddha is opposed. I was kind of hoping that some of them would be here for me to ask questions of, but they're not, so I'll suspend my questions for now.
Representative McGaugh, I'm sure, representatives from everywhere will be available to answer questions. Do you want to sit down?
And we plan on sending them the updated information, which obviously their letters in opposition did not contemplate because they didn't know about it. This is new information that the FDA now has rescinding their previous statements about the dangers of kratom.
Okay.
All right, any other questions? The Speaker Pro Tem Kennedy.
Thank you. So, Floor Manager Edwards, thank you very much, as well as Mac, for this information. There are quite a few letters in here, and Mac, I do appreciate the fact that you have provided so much information to the committee today, because for all intents and purposes, this is almost like the Department of Health phoning this one in by just taking out the letter from last year and changing the date on it and not providing any new information because they lack that new information about what the FDA has done here. I am curious, why do you think that the FDA was so aggressive in order to get states to seek to ban kratom during that period of 2013 and 2017? And there were only 5 states that turned out to be gullible enough to do so. Unfortunately for us, Rhode Island was one of them. The only state in this particular area. And I do believe Vermont has rescinded the ban. Are they any closer to being able to offer the product there?
Well, first, Representative Kennedy, the FDA's position in 2016 and their encouragement of all 50 states to ban kratom was based on their belief that they were going to be able to successfully get the scheduling recommendation approved by the DEA, which they'd done in 82 previous attempts. They didn't think this was a problem. They ran into a problem because of their lack of evidence. Vermont is in the process of rulemaking now. They gave us an email saying they accepted our petition to remove it, and it's going through rulemaking, and they're going to want the Kratom Consumer Protection Act because they don't want to be out there just saying you can buy kratom. It should have a KCPA attached to it, so they're working hard on that at the legislative end. So I think that's great. I think what the FDA did, and I think they did it in good faith, by the way, setting aside their bias against all dietary supplements, which they don't like being on the marketplace, they believe that the reports of deaths associated with kratom that occurred in Sweden, where there were 9 deaths in a 12-month period, were concerning. But they ignored the evidence that was provided by scientists in Sweden that looked at it and found that those kratom products were all adulterated with O-desmethyltramadol at a fatal dose. The FDA just didn't recognize or didn't want to. They expressed a concern. Their position today is dramatically different than it was in 2016, and they know they cannot sustain a scheduling recommendation to ban kratom today.
Yeah. And I know there was a series of news stories that the Tampa Bay newspaper did in 2023, where I think, based on the stories that I read, they were seeking to attribute a number of deaths that occurred in Florida strictly to kratom. Now, I think based on what you testified to, where the FDA had set a certain number, which was 4 grams, I believe you said, and
12 grams.
well, there used to be 4 grams before that the FDA was saying, you know, that if you went more than that, it was almost going to be a toxic situation for you. But then through some of the work that they've done, they've now reached 12 grams and they still haven't had any adverse effects. So
Just nausea.
just nausea.
For 2 of 40 participants, yeah.
So, you know, based on that, you know, have there been any situations that you're aware of where kratom has been the sole cause and effect of a death? Or have the cases been where there is some other product that they may have taken, such as fentanyl or some other adverse product that may have been the actual cause of those deaths?
So I was just on a national public radio interview with the 2 of the Tampa Bay reporters, and I called them out for their deadly dose headline. I didn't know this. They informed me that they don't write the headlines, that someone else does that. And he said there was a misunderstanding. This is the reporter, said there was a misunderstanding about the deaths that were associated. They had 46 deaths reported by medical examiners to be kratom only. I referred him to the Centers for Disease Control study that said there's not standardized postmortem toxicology methodologies used. There's not a toxic dose, which this reporter agreed to, and they even said it in their article. There is no known toxic dose of kratom that would cause a death. And so what we find is that many of these medical examiners were misled by the FDA. The FDA said it was dangerous, which is how Rhode Island got in the situation it's in today. That's the problem, and that's what we're trying to correct. There is no known fatal dose of kratom. The Centers for Disease Control called out the reports from medical examiners. They looked at the toxicology and blood screens for the deaths that were reported as kratom only, but for one that didn't have a blood sample, they found all with more sophisticated equipment that typically a medical examiner corner won't have. They found they're all polydrug use. So it's just been misreported, and I think as we get more clarity, more evidence about the potential benefits of kratom and the lack of evidence on the danger side, I think we're going to see a better view that's provided by the FDA and by medical examiners.
So one of the letters that I actually read on this suggested that perhaps we need to create a kratom control board similar to the cannabis control board that has been created in the state of Rhode Island. I think there's a big difference here from what I can see, and perhaps I've got a reverse thought of logic here, but In the case of cannabis, the federal government still views that as a controlled substance, and individual states have been approving it. In the case of kratom, it's not a controlled substance. It has never been a controlled substance, and 45 states currently allow for the purchase of over-the-counter sales. And are you aware of any state that has a kratom control board?
None, because as you correctly pointed out, it's not a controlled substance and wouldn't be appropriate to have that kind of oversight, a regulatory oversight, imposing any standard on kratom that's not documented by the science that would demonstrate that it needs to be treated as a controlled substance. There's now the Wisconsin Controlled Substances Board, one of the states that fell into the trap the FDA laid for them in 2016. They conducted a year-long review of kratom, and they determined from the Controlled Substances Board in Wisconsin that it was not appropriate for scheduling. So I think that there's an awakening that's coming. For the FDA, it's a day of reckoning, but there's an awakening coming about the information that's been available up till now about kratom. Should kratom be regulated? Absolutely. There are people that are subject to misusing and abusing products, and so certainly we should regulate it, keep it out of the hands of kids, make sure it's labeled properly. There should be no kratom product that enters the marketplace that doesn't have a recommended serving size or the number of serving size during the day. That's important, but the black market kratom that's being sold over the internet today in Rhode Island doesn't have any of that. And that's tragic, and we need to control that.
Thank you, Chairman.
Representative McGaugh.
Just to follow up on that quickly, I'm just trying to figure out what the oversight is on this then. I know, so it's not reviewed by the FDA, it's not under the purview of the DEA. I'm just wondering how much oversight there is of this product to ensure that if people are purchasing this at their convenience store or gas station, that they know what they're getting. And what types of oversight are there other than reverse looking, were there an issue? What types of oversight are there to protect the health and safety of patients?
So in the 11 states that have passed the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, and we hope Rhode Island will be 12, there are appropriate controls over the kinds of products that can enter the marketplace in your state. So you can't sell a kratom product in Rhode Island unless it's properly labeled, that it's been manufactured, and it's actually what it says it is. So that's what the certificate of analysis will be due, and the labeling requirements on it, and the age restriction. In the other states, there are no restrictions. We have reported over 90 companies to the FDA that are illegally marketing kratom today with a therapeutic claim that's illegal, and the FDA has not prosecuted a single one.
But those are states where it's currently not legal to sell it there, where it's currently legal for them to purchase it, but there's just no oversight. In Rhode Island, we're in a different scenario because currently people are not able to purchase it in the state of Rhode Island. So that's why I'm just wondering if there's any type of regulatory review when drugs come out. For example, they have routine inspections of the facilities that are distributing them, of the processors, if you will, from the language. And I'm just wondering what type of review there is for the processors of this to ensure before it makes it to the market that these products are safe.
So right now there's no regulation. The FDA will not impose any regulations, which what the federal Kratom Consumer Protection Act will do. But the protection for consumers, right now in Rhode Island, you cannot go to a brick and mortar store and buy kratom, where you could have confidence, where there's a regulated product on the shelves that is labeled properly, restricted for age. None of that. They're buying it on the black market, and they're getting potentially crap. And we think that's important. But to your point, the way that dietary supplements are regulated in the United States today is there's a MedWatch program administered by the FDA. So if there is a complaint that's issued about an adverse event or an inappropriate sale of the product, it is referred under MedWatch to the FDA. If they get a cluster of reports of violations, then they act. There's not been an action against kratom under the MedWatch program that the FDA administers. But we think it's an important enhancement here in Rhode Island to be able to have the standard, and if anyone wants to complain that it's being sold inappropriately or the product itself doesn't meet the standards of the state, then that retailer can be fined, or the processor can be fined for entering a product. That's an important safety mechanism for Rhode Islanders.
So the safety mechanisms would all be retroactive.
which is what the dietary supplement industry does in the United States. Absolutely correct.
Okay. Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We have 3 more witnesses on this bill, and I just want to remind all the witnesses that if you've provided written testimony, the committee does get a copy of that. So if we could just kind of like narrow the issues down to new information that hasn't been already discussed. We'll bring up Todd Griffin and Mike Overstreet. Can't read the last name. Overstreet. Welcome, Todd. If the red light is on, the microphone is on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee members. My name is Todd Griffin. I'm a professor of chemistry at Wingate University. I have a long history of various interactions with hazardous materials. My previous background was I was the chief scientist for Naval Surface Warfare Center, where we developed detectors trying to help search out clandestine laboratories for drugs and explosives and things of that nature. In the last 2 years, I've been working very closely at the university and with another local company looking at natural products and functional foods, including kratom. And one of the things that has been very remarkable to me is knowing the reason we did our detection business was because of the nearly 100,000 people that had died at the time of overdoses. And seeing a potential product that may be able to provide some relief of that was very interesting to me. So I started my research, as all good scientists do, by hitting the scientific literature to see what previously had been published. It became very clear that at that time that there wasn't a ton of stuff that has been done, but now there's over 500 peer-reviewed articles on kratom research, and it's absolutely astonishing the types of pharmacology that they're coming up with and the results that they're seeing. I'd like to highlight a couple of them. Since my background is in analytical chemistry, I want to know what it is, how much it is, and where it came from. That's my mantra as an analytical chemist. So when I look at reports where kratom has been assigned as the only drug associated with a death or fatality, I've seen reports from Dr. Marilyn Hustis, who has done some of her own research, and she referred me to a couple of articles, including one from the state of Colorado. Mac actually mentioned it, where every drug death that had been associated with kratom that had blood samples left in retention, they sent them off for advanced toxicology screening and found several respiratory depressants, opiates, present in those. So those are classified under what we would call novel psychoactive substances. And this is a game that we play with the drug cartels out there. Fentanyl, for instance, everybody knows fentanyl. But I would say, which flavor of fentanyl is your favorite? Acetylfentanyl? Isofentanyl? Carfentanyl? Because all that happens is you go in and you modify the drug slightly, the pharmacology stays similar, and the drug testing is rendered useless. So in a lot of the cases, I've actually read some of the cases where they said that a patient came and presented with respiratory suppression, and they treated with naloxone and got a reversal. And they did GCMS analysis and found no other substances that would account for that. Well, GCMS analysis would not pick up on new psychoactive substances, plain and simple. There is research that shows that kratom itself, the main active compound, metragenine, is metabolized in the liver through a cytochrome P453A mechanism. We also see that it does interact with brain receptors, the mu-opioid receptor, the kappa, the delta. It also interacts with adrenal receptors. It also interacts with other receptors. It's a multifaceted, very interesting drug. One of the things that has been absolutely verified is the fact that and you'll appreciate this, Representative McGaul, that the mechanism of interaction with these opioid receptors we're learning so much more about it. For instance, the positioning in the pocket of the opioid receptor triggers downstream signaling in the cell, whether it's some G protein or something else. Beta arrestin 2 is the mechanism that's associated with respiratory suppression. And that's what you use Narcan to reverse, is that beta arrestin pathway that's being triggered. And metragenine does not recruit beta arrestin. So when I see reports that say naloxone was used to reverse it, I have no doubt that that's true. And I have no doubt that they didn't find anything with a GCMS. But I do have doubts that they screened for everything. Because as a scientist that used to work for the government, my sponsors wanted very simple things. They wanted me to make a handheld sensor that could detect everything, never false alarm on anything. I referred them to Dr. Spock's tricorder. We work very hard to make these techniques that can detect broadband bad stuff. But at the end of the day, our forensics toxicology labs are underfunded. Most of the state and local labs can't even screen for metragenine, let alone the MPSs that we're dealing with on a daily basis. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Representative McGough.
Thank you for being here tonight. I'm sorry I missed. Where are you? What university are you from?
Wingate University in North Carolina.
Wigan?
Wingate. Yeah,
Wingate. Okay.
You have to say it Wingate.
I'm
W-I-N-G-A-T-E.
I just didn't catch it.
Yeah.
In regards to the naloxone, my understanding is that any of the toxicology references for a kratom overdose would refer you to naloxone. Is that correct?
That is what they're saying is the standard of care, standard of treatment for it.
Okay. And then just to clarify, you talked about it being metabolized through the cytochrome P450 system, and I didn't catch what it was metabolized to, just so that I could do further research.
Sure, absolutely. 7-hydroxymetragenine. That is the partial agonist that has the most activity at the mu opioid receptor.
Okay. Thank you.
Representative Newberry, would you like your votes recorded in the affirmative?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So ordered. Any other questions? Seeing none, move to the next witness.
Hi, my name is Mike Overstreet. I'm a kratom.
The red button on.
It's on. Okay, good. Hi, my name is Mike Overstreet. I'm a kratom consumer and advocate. I came from Massachusetts today to provide my public testimony because kratom has helped me so much in my life, and I've seen really great things that it's done for so many people. Years ago, I was severely addicted to opiates, then stuck on Suboxone for over 8 years. Suboxone really helped at first, but then started to affect my overall mood and happiness, negatively affect. I suffered greatly on Suboxone, especially with dental damage, and the FDA recently quietly released that Suboxone causes serious dental damage, including in people with no history of dental problems. And that's now the gold standard of treatment is Suboxone, and there's several lawsuits going on about people who have extreme dental damage, such as myself. And I found that kratom just helps so much more. If I had ever known how much kratom medical cannabis helps with severe debilitating pain, I would have never touched Suboxone. I'm the host and producer of a podcast called Kratom Guy Show, where we often are joined by influential doctors and advocates from around the nation. We've had numerous doctors as well as both behavioral and addiction psychologists on the show, and they all agree on one thing, that kratom should not be banned and consumers should not be criminalized. My recent work has crossed over to a realm of criminal and social justice, focusing on the very real, destructive, violent, and deadly ramifications of bans on kratom and similar plant medicines. Our work took this turn with the arrest, the Schedule 1 narcotics trafficking charge, conviction, and 10-year prison sentence, and subsequent in-custody death of Marshall Ray Price, December 2022 in Greene County, Arkansas. And that was for a bag about this big. He got 10 years in prison, and that's the law in Rhode Island as well. And I don't think there's anybody on this committee that should say that I shouldn't go home to my son for something like that. So it is a non-violent, victimless crime, and kratom being Schedule 1 in Rhode Island is punishable up to life in prison and a $500,000 fine. So a bag like this could get me life in prison in Rhode Island. We've also helped Shayna Brown in Escambia County, Alabama. Shayna was originally given the bond of $1 million. Together with a group of advocates, we formed a grassroots advocacy group called Botanical Action Network to help people like Shayna and Marshall, whose lives have been ruined by this war on kratom, as well as to provide up-to-date science to expose and dispel misinformation surrounding kratom and other plant medicines. Together, we were able to help fundraise enough money to hire Shayna a great attorney who specializes in high-profile drug cases, as well as help to bond her out of jail. Shayna is currently out on bond and is awaiting indictment by a grand jury and to go to trial for also trafficking in Schedule 1 narcotics. Shayna is facing mandatory minimum trafficking charges in Alabama of 10 years to life in prison. Both Shayna and Marshall were charged for crimes involving no victim, harming nobody, and their big crimes was ground up tea leaves. So part of this is about how it is a biased partial agonist versus traditional opioid, which is derived from morphine or poppy, non-biased full agonist. But the other speaker here has already touched on that. Those original 44 deaths involve duplicate reports, murder by gunshot wound to the chest, suicide by hanging, suicide determined. The primary cause of death was apparent suicide from the intentional abuse of acetaminophen, 9 deaths in Sweden by a tramadol synthetic. Another case fell out of a window, broken arm and a leg, refused medical treatment, was found to be on drugs and alcohol. He later died, kratom-related death, and as well as duplicate reports and self-reporting. The New England Journal of Medicine looked into deaths in Colorado attributed to kratom, and in their review, in quotes, we reviewed Colorado death certificates for any mention of kratom or michidine from 1999 to 2017 and identified 15 kratom-related deaths. Autopsy reports were reviewed for all 15 deaths, which included 13 men, 2 women with a median age of 28. On the basis of toxicology testing, 11 cases involved multi-drug ingestion. An 8-person had positive test results for other opioids. 4 deaths were reported to involve michidine only, and the coroners attributed each to michidine toxicity. We further investigated the 4 deaths that appeared to be due to michidine only, reviewing police investigation records for all 4 and performing comprehensive toxicology screening with high-performance liquid chromatography with tandem mass spectrometry for the 3 cases for which residual blood was available. In our investigation of all 15 kratom-related deaths, we determined that 14 deaths clearly involved multiple drugs. Michidine levels varied. Residual blood was not available for the final test.
All right, Mike, I think we should probably go into some questions. Are there any questions for Mike? You do, Representative McGaugh?
I'm sorry. So the bag that you have in front of you, that's actually a bag of kratom,
Yes.
which is currently a Schedule 1 controlled substance in Rhode
Representative
Island.
McGaugh.
I just want to be clear.
Representative McGaugh, I think we should.
Okay. I just one question. You were also asking. You were talking about the Suboxone, and you were concerned about the long-term effects of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just wondering what information you have about the long-term effects of kratom.
I don't. I just know my teeth aren't falling out from taking it.
Okay.
All right. Thank you very much for your testimony on this.
I actually have that email that Mac referenced from the Southern District of California.
Yeah, so if you want to provide it to the committee, that's fine as well. If you want to provide a written copy,
Okay. Well,
appreciate it.
yeah.
Thank you, Mike. Last up, we have Claudia Morandi. And while Claudia is coming up, Bob Jacquard and Steve Ells from the Kratom Association signed up in favor, not testifying, provide a written testimony. And Stacy Paterno from the Rhode Island Medical Society signed up against, not testifying, but she did provide written testimony. Claudia, welcome.
Hello, my name is Claudia Morandi. I'm the founder of the Doctor-Patient Forum. I represent an estimated 8 to 10 million people who can no longer access pain medication due to the crackdown on opioid prescribing. My constituents consist of people with cancer, people with sickle cell, multiple sclerosis, people like myself. I've had Crohn's disease since I was a child, many people with debilitating back pain. Doctors are simply too afraid to prescribe opioids in the state of Rhode Island. And even though we have a law, it's not being enforced. I also represent people who struggle with addiction, who have been able to break free from an opioid called Suboxone, which, as we know today, is linked to dental decay. We have many Suboxone dental decay lawsuits throughout the country, and now studies are showing that Suboxone is also linked to suicide, to excessive sweating, to feelings of flat affect. And what these two vastly different communities have in common, because they're vastly different, is they have found solace with Kratom. It's not uncommon for people to call me before their first suicide attempt. I was called in to advocate for a gentleman who has ALS. And because he lives in Rhode Island, not only is he unable to find a doctor who's willing to treat his pain, but he couldn't even find Kratom. I have constituents in 45 other states who have been able to manage their pain safely with Kratom, but for whatever reason, we still have this ridiculous ban on Kratom. What we've done is we have terrorized doctors, so they're no longer treating pain, and I can assure you none of us are getting any younger here. Eventually, everybody's going to be affected. If we're not going to enforce the law where people can have access to full agonist opioids, for the love of gravy, let's lift this ban on Kratom. As Mac pointed out, Dr. McDonald, who's no longer with Rhode Island, is now in New York, and we don't hear a peep from him about Kratom. Enough is enough. Let's lift the ban on Kratom so people can have access to safe Kratom. I thank you for tonight.
Questions for Claudia? Speaker Pro Tem Kennedy.
Claudia, thank you very much. I really do appreciate your comments this afternoon regarding the legislation and the individuals that you're advocating for. As I pointed out earlier, our Department of Health phoned this one in and basically just mimeographed off last year's letter and just stamped today's date on it. But we also had the same thing happen with the acting director of the Department of Behavioral Health Care, Developmental Disabilities and Hospitals, who seemed to think that everything we need to know about Kratom only occurred up until 2022. No knowledge whatsoever of any of this very recent information that has come out of the FDA this year for 2024 between December of 2023 and February of 2024. So, based on everything that you have brought forth to the committee, I encourage you to continue to advocate for the community that you represent. I will tell you that we traditionally have held a meeting with the Department of Health director. Of course, the acting director, will be leaving in about 2.5 weeks, so we didn't even bother to make an attempt to schedule that meeting this year with the Department of Health. But we've also had, in the past, many positive comments come back from our meeting, only to be, as after we left, a couple of weeks later, only to find out that what we thought were positive comments from the department were anything but that. So, as I said, I encourage you to continue to advocate for your community. I'm hoping that Rhode Island gets out of being one of these minority states and actually does the right thing by passing the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, so that our constituents who rely and want to rely on these Kratom products will have that opportunity.
Yeah, prohibition is inherently a bad thing, and we need to learn from our history so we can prevent people from hitting the streets and being poisoned by fentanyl that's coming through our borders. If the doctors aren't going to treat people's pain with compassion, let these people have access to Kratom, not Kratom from a gas station, safe Kratom. It works, and it's the right thing to do for the people of Rhode Island. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. And that concludes the hearing on House Bill 7231. Next, we're going to go to Chairman